The first topic I would like to start with is the school system and their inequality towards black areas. White schools receive more resources than black schools since the Reconstruction era, which was between 1863 through 1877. The racism in the school system began shortly after the Civil War ended and the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. Congress passed three constitutional amendments in 1860s, known as the Reconstruction Amendments, that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, which is our 13th Amendment, which provided citizenship to those who are born or naturalized in the United States, regardless of race. That's our 14th Amendment, and guaranteed the right of all citizens to vote, which is our 15th Amendment. Following the decade known as the Reconstruction era, this was an attempt by the U.S. government to add the inequalities and protect the rights of newly enfranchised African Americans. In the 1800s, the resurgence of white supremacy in the South and the rollback of these advancements, which were the Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, and enslavement through convict leasing, eliminating the gains made by freed people. One of the most infamous Supreme Court rulings that codified the state-sanctioned segregation and provided the foundation for the institutionalized inequalities was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. The Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 finally overturned the Plessy separation but gave little instruction on how to implement the newly integrated schools and other services. With no instruction in place on how to process should be implemented, how this process should be implemented, led to converting racism and segregation. Particularly noticeable in schools that were located in and how they were resourced. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is the NAACP, began fighting for racial equality through the creation of the legislation that would protect African Americans from racial discriminatory laws. In the 1930s, they turned their focus to the education, eventually culminating in the Brown versus Board of Education of 1954, the ruling that finally overturned formal racial segregation in public schools. Regarded as one of the most consequential legal judgments, Brown versus the Board of Education actually consists of 5 different cases. The first one is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Bridges versus Elliott, Davis versus the Board of Education of Prince Edward County, which is in Virginia, Bowling versus Sharp, and Gilbert versus Ethel, each centering around the constitutionalization of school segregation. However, the Supreme Court did not provide any guidelines on implementation of these decisions until the following year. And it would take many more years for all public schools to be desegregated. The Little Rock Nine illustrates the educational apartheid and intense resistance that white Southerners had towards the integration in 1957. In contrast to the loud and disruptive resistance to the integration, Southern states also intact and covert methods of segregation. By using the home addresses to determine school placement. Now, black children in redline communities were barred from accessing the same education as their white peers when this method was put in place, even though redlining was outlawed in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. Today, 2 out of 3 minority through redlining outlawed in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. Today, 2 out of 3 minority students attend schools that are predominantly minority and funded well below their suburbia counterparts. The No Child Left Behind Act was put in place by the government in 2001. This act can make schools more likely to push out low performing students in order to meet the national testing standards, which only serves to compound the existing problems while overlooking the systematic roots that generate income in the neighborhoods and the educational discrimination. The educational gap, because of the test scores, the socioeconomic status, and the impact of COVID-19, black children are still racially and socioeconomically isolated, and the racial achievement gap between black and white students has only widened. The educational achievement gap measures the difference in the academic outcomes, usually based on standardized test scores, between students of different racial groups. The education achievement gap is defined as the difference in the academic outcomes between historically advantaged and disadvantaged groups. Most often discussed in the text of the standardized test scores between black and Hispanic and white students. The achievement gap has declined since the 1970s, but it still remains significant today. Now, based on the standardized test scores, white students are roughly 2 years ahead of black and Hispanic students in terms of education. This varies greatly across cities and states. Atlanta has the largest achievement gap, with white students testing almost 5 years ahead of black students. The implicit bias and racism held by teachers and academic institutions and standardized testing methods continue to drive disparities. Now, the second topic I would like to speak about is having more black teachers in our classrooms. Because of the racism and the bias that many white teachers have for black students, we need to change this. We need to have more overly qualified black teachers in our classrooms. Did you know that black educators are the key changing agents in our schools and communities, but they are scarce and underrepresented? Nationally, Only 12% of public school teachers are black, and only 2% are black males. Having more black males teachers in our schools will allow them to act as role models for the underrepresented black male students. By infusing more diversity, well prepared educators into our urban communities, we create a positive impact for all students and contributing to a more just and equitable society. Increasing the number of black teachers in the classroom can have several positive effects on our students. Black teachers can serve as a positive role model for the black students who may be more likely to identify and relate to a teacher who shares their same racial and cultural backgrounds. Representation matters, and having black teachers can help the students feel seen, valued, and understood. Black teachers are often better equipped to understand and incorporate the cultural experiences and perspectives of black students into their teachings. This approach is known as a cultural responsive teaching that can help create a more inclusive and welcoming learning environment for black students. Research has shown black students perform better academically when they have a black teacher. One study found that just one black teacher in an elementary school significantly reduces the likelihood of dropping out of high school for lower income boys. Another study found that black teachers can also serve as advocates and provide support for the black students who may face unique challenges and barriers in school. Black teachers may be better equipped to understand and address the issues related to the social bias, the discrimination, and the microaggressions that black students may face. Overall, having more black teachers in our classrooms can help create a more equitable and supportive educational environment for black students and may help to narrow the achievement gap between black and white students. The next topic that I would like to speak about in my speech is going to be the effects that COVID-19 had on the education system, the education of our black students. Now, the COVID-19 crisis is hurting all of our communities, but it's not equally. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on the learning experience of African American students. It's already clear that communities of color, including children, once again are on the front lines of vulnerability with limited access to technology. Many African American students come from lower income families that may not have access to reliable internet connections or the necessary technologies to participate in remote learning. This has led to the increase of disparities in access to the education and has put many African American students at a disadvantage. African American communities have been disappropriated impact by the pandemic, both in terms of health outcomes and economic consequences. The stress and trauma of these experiences can take a toll on students' mental health and the ability to focus on their studies. African American students often rely on school as a support system with access to counseling services, mentorships, and other resources. With remote learning, many of these support systems have been disrupted, leaving students feeling isolated and unsupported. Remote learning has been a challenging experience for many students, by far, particularly those that struggle with attention and focus. Now, this is something that I do have a lot of knowledge in because I do have a child that struggles with attention and focusing. He does have ADHD. So when we were out for with the pandemic and they were doing online learning only, it was a big struggle for him. Now, and that was only partly on behalf of the lack of the in-person interaction and the structure that made it difficult for him to be able to stay engaged and be motivated to complete his studies. Now, for many African American students, school is also an important socialization opportunity. Remote learning has limited that ability of the students to interact with other peers and build social skills, which could have been a long-term consequence on their overall development. Now, a June 2020 study by McKinsey suggests that given these statistics, the educational achievement gap may grow an additional 15 to 20%. High school dropout rates are also estimated to increase 2 to 9% given the disruption to after school support. Academic motivation and achievements are also likely to be impacted harder to quantify the factors such as greater social and anxiety and isolation. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on African American learning, exacerbating the existence disparities and creating new challenges for the students, family, and educators. It is important for our policymakers and educators to address these issues and work to assure that all students have access to resources and the support they need to succeed. In conclusion, the school system in the United States of America has historically perpetuated inequalities for Black students, including disparities in access to quality education, resources, and opportunities. Increasing the number of Black teachers in our classroom can be an effective way to help address these disparities by providing positive role models, culturally responsive teachers, and the support of Black students. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has further highlighted the exacerbation of these inequalities, particularly for low-income Black students who may not have access to the necessary technology or support systems for remote learning. It is crucial, I say crucial, for our policymakers and educators to address these issues and work to create a more equitable and supportive educational environment for all students, particularly those who have had the historically been margined and underserved. Now, in closing, that was my speech. I hope we can get more involved and push our policymakers to make these changes as soon as possible so that we can create a more just and equal education.